And so I will give you indeed the genotoxic compounds in EU food safety policy. So in fact, the basis is the general food law saying, okay, we have to ensure a high level of human health and animal health protection, and also all feed and food placed on the EU market shall be safe. So also the general food law clearly provides also the principles and saying that in order to achieve this high level of protection of human health and animal health, EU food and feed safety legislation has to be based upon risk analysis. And the risk assessment has to be done in an independent way, in an excellent way, and indeed for EU feed and food safety legislation, that is indeed performed by the European Food Safety Authority. From a risk management point of view, then we shall take into account the results of the risk assessment, but we have also to take into account other factors legitimate to the matter under consideration. So now, when looking at genotoxic compounds, and indeed, how to look into us from an assessment point of view or from a prioritization point of view, we have two approaches, the threshold of toxicological concern, and also, as Diane already explained this morning, the margin of exposure. And threshold of toxicological concern is not, of course, a tool only for genotoxic compounds. It's also for many other compounds for which indeed they are found in food in low concentrations, and indeed they are now detectable, and it's impossible to have for all these individual substances toxicological data, and so therefore the threshold of toxicological concern is a tool to assess the potential health significance of these previously undetectable trace substances. You know all that indeed the approach can be used when the chemical structure of the substance is known, and of course you have also to be able to perform exposure assessment. And so, but it is clear that when we talk about the prioritization tool for genotoxic compounds, we clearly also outline in the EU that the TTC approach is not applicable for substances for which EU feed and food safety legislation requires the submission of toxicity data. And that is in most cases the case when, for indeed, the authorization of food additive, plant protection products, food contact materials, whatever. Of course, it is also not applicable when indeed there are sufficient data, toxicity data, for performing a proper risk assessment. And of course, it is also not applicable for a number of substances which falls under these categories, these high potency carcinogens, the number of inorganic substances, proteins, steroids, substances that are known or predicted to bioaccumulate, nanomaterials, radioactive materials, and also mixtures of substances which contain both known and unknown chemical structure. So for the substances that have the potential to be DNA reactive mutagens and or carcinogens, based on the weight of evidence, the relevant threshold of toxicological concern is in fact 2.5 nanogram per kilogram body weight. The other assessment prioritization tool is the margin of exposure. And that is, of course, indeed used for these cases where it is impossible to derive or inappropriate to derive a health-based guidance value. Diane did already explain it, so I will not go into much detail on it. Indeed, where the cases where it can be used. And indeed, so we also there, Diane already outlined the BMDL 10, and so the 10,000 is indeed, might be considered as a low priority for risk management action. So I highlight that in bold because it's not a quantification of the risk, as also Diane explained. And also, it says also that the judgment is in fact ultimately a matter for the risk managers, although that is also difficult because if indeed risk assessors cannot express the risk or indicate the health concern, how can then risk managers? But of course, I take it that indeed it is also a matter for the risk managers as well. Also, indeed, well, and important is that when indeed there is an MOE of less than 10,000, some people would say, well, there's no risk, so no measures are needed. It is also clear that it is just a prioritization tool. So it does not mean that even in cases where the MOE is lower than 10,000, risk management measures can still be taken. And I will also come back on that later. So when we say now in the EU food safety legislation, the approach of risk management approach to genotoxic compounds, there is an enormous difference, what I would call, between the substances and their residues requiring authorization before their use in or on food, and I will call them hereafter regulated substances, and then, of course, contaminants, which is in fact my comfort zone. So, in fact, for the regulated products, which indeed a substance to be authorized has been identified to be genotoxic, no safe dose can be established, and indeed no authorization and also no use in food. So that is very straightforward. A genotoxic compound cannot be authorized for use in food, and so but there is, of course, we have substances, but of course in the production there might be impurities. And so these impurities, they can be genotoxic or genotoxic carcinogen. And for that, EFSA in 2012 has issued a statement that while indeed the substance, there's no issue that this cannot be not genotoxic, but in case there are impurities which are genotoxic or genotoxic carcinogen, in these cases, a margin of exposure approach could be used for indeed expressing if indeed it would be acceptable from a public health point of view. And it is only indicating a level of concern, not quantifying the risk. And so for these impurities, EFSA could conclude that the margin of exposure is of high concern, low concern, or unlikely to be a health concern. It's clear that if indeed the conclusion from EFSA is high concern, the substance will also, because of this impurity, not be authorized. If it is of low concern or unlikely to be of safety concern, it could be authorized. But there is indeed also challenges, because we have the case, for instance, of of smoke flavorings, which are a mixture of different compounds. And, of course, they are not impurities, they are compounds of the mixture. And, indeed, few compounds are genotoxic. The 2,5-OH furanon and the benzenediol, they are genotoxic. Consequently, EFSA concluded that a health concern could not be excluded. And consequently, we will have to take the risk management measures. But of course, I don't know the concentration of these substances in the mixture, because indeed EFSA has said for a mixture approach, each individual compound has to be also not genotoxic. But in case it would have been an impurity, then a margin of exposure approach could have been used. So you see the thin line between indeed a component, maybe in a low concentration, compared to an impurity. For instance, where indeed we have applied this approach is in the case of these mono-D glycerides of fatty acids, the E471. which is an emulsifier, which is authorized as a food additive, which has been also reauthorized as a food additive after re-evaluation, but it contains glycidyl esters, indeed, and there EFSA has evaluated it, and based upon the MOE approach, considered that even indeed if we set strict specifications, because we had set strict specifications for these glycidyl esters also in the emulsifiers, that they are indeed still safe to be used. So you can see where for the regulated products these impurities is indeed aware. Now moving to contaminants. In fact, mainly the basic definition of the contaminant means any substance not intentionally added to food. Which means that in fact, if you read at this definition, it says also it can be present in food as a result of the production, which means can also be of the application of pesticide, plant protection products, or of veterinary medicines. However, when we then look into the regulatory framework for contaminants, which is the 31593, it clearly says that it does not apply to contaminants which are the subject of more specific EU legislation, be it like, for instance, plant protection products, like veterinary drugs, or food contact materials. So I would like to stress that further reference to the contaminants in my presentation refers to contaminants which are within the scope of Regulation 31593, and which are the ones then which are within the scope that can be indeed natural plant toxins, can also be mycotoxins, can also be contaminants from environmental pollution, or indeed from the unintended consequences of cooking or manufacturing processes, be it the processing contaminants. How do we deal then with indeed contaminants, the risk management approach? Well, generally we have the overall principle that contaminants shall be kept as low as can be reasonably achieved by following good practices at all stages of the production chain, the so-called ALARA principle. And these maximum levels are established following the ALARA principle. And this principle also applies to genotoxic carcinogens or genotoxic substances. From a risk management point of view, generally, from a risk assessment point of view, generally the MOE approach is used for contaminants that are genotoxic carcinogens. Only, maybe I have missed one, but for alternaria toxins, the TTC approach was used to see indeed if there would be a potential health concern for the alternariol and the alternariol monomethyl ether, which are considered as potential genotoxic substances. There, in this particular opinion from EFSA, the TTC approach was used to identify if there is a possible concern, yes or no, because it is not indeed a risk assessment, but it indicates if there might be further toxicity studies needed to confirm the concern, to confirm also the genotoxicity, and so on. Now, indeed, some practical experiences, and as already announced, indeed, aflatoxins is one which has been going along with me for more than my 25 years in the European Commission, and it's still a topic that keeps me busy, not every day, but very regularly. And in fact, we had this regulation back in 2000, and that was before the use of the MOE, because the MOE approach was in 2005, the EFSA opinion, which Diane printed out the front page. And there we set maximum levels for aflatoxins as low as possible. And in fact, we did then look more to what is analytically achievable to quantify than really what is achievable by applying good practices. And so there we had set very strict levels. Also within the Commission, that was possible. That was the post-BSE period. And I know that the industry was a bit complaining that these levels are not achievable, and they went up high in the Commission to try to block it. Me as a young official, I was also there, a bit scared, because, and indeed there was then this approach saying, well, the industry explained why these levels are not needed, that they are not achievable, and so on. And then my Director General said, well, he said, I don't know all the details, but he says, my colleague here says that aflatoxins are genotoxic carcinogens, and there can be no safe dose be established. Is that true? Of course, the industry representative said, yes. Well, he said, then people, you may be happy that we have still established 2 microgram for aflatoxin B1 and 4 microgram for aflatoxin total, and not 0, because indeed, normally we would have followed the 0 approach for substances which there is no safe level. So that was indeed before the MOE. Then we had the discussions also in Codex, and there was the request to have a Codex position on maximum levels for aflatoxins in hazelnuts, pistachios, and also almonds. And of course, there was the discussion to set higher levels than the ones we had set back in 2000. And, well, in order to see if we could accept to a certain extent, because we did believe that from a technical point of view that the levels might a bit be higher because the 2 and the 4 were not really achievable following good practices at all stages. But of course, we had to make sure that it is also not creating a public health concern. And so we asked EFSA, and that was maybe one of the first cases where the MOE approach was effectively applied, is indeed they came to the conclusion that changing, for instance, the maximum levels for total aflatoxins from 4 to 8 or 10 micrograms, so an increase, double or 2.5, they indicate that they're saying, okay, would have minor effects on the estimates of the calculated MOEs. And that was the basis for the EU to accept in Codex a higher level and consequently afterwards also amend the EU legislation by setting higher levels for a genotoxic carcinogen. But then in 2018, we had a similar question, but now for peanuts. And there, EFSA followed not the MOE approach, but indeed a calculated cancer risks. And there, for the same increase for peanuts from 4 to 10 microgram per kilogram, the conclusion was the calculated cancer risks indicate that an increase of the ML would further increase the risk by a factor of 1.6 to 1.8. And that was, in fact, for the risk manager, the reason why we could not accept in Codex a higher level, because this is not, does indicate an increase of risk, and that we could not make it. And so, finally, we did not accept it, and still ongoing in Codex, but still, as EU, we remain of the position that we cannot accept a higher level than the 4 microgram per kilogram established in EU legislation in 2000. Finally now, EFSA had also made a recent 4 or 5 years ago, comprehensive risk assessment of aflatoxins in food. And now you can see that still the MOE values for aflatoxin B1 exposure varied from 5,000 to 29. And of course, if you calculate that by the 10,000, this raises, of course, a health concern. But indeed, I put it here, the challenge for the risk manager, because in fact, for aflatoxins, we have in the EU worldwide the most strict EU legislation with the most strict maximum levels. We are at the end of what we could set. And so, in fact, yeah, we can, or indeed, when we would lower the levels, we would have a problem with the achievability. And so we cannot indeed bring it to a situation where we could say, based upon the current approaches, where we see the MOEs much lower than 10,000, there is no health concern. We cannot say this. So maybe there is a need that we get a better guidance to say, okay, when should we really go down that there is a health concern, and we have to go down, even if it requires big efforts from the industry, or where, in which cases we could be indeed, well, see what is achievable by applying good practices and set a level there. So this is indeed the point where maybe more guidance could be from the risk assessors would be helpful. The other case is, this has been a bit not been aligned, but the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And there you can see that we have, in fact, MOEs which are around the 10,000, not so for high-level consumers. Not even indeed for average consumers, it's above 10,000. So indeed, it is of relatively low concern. The potential concern for consumer health is low. I cannot go down, but should have been aligned for having it in the presentation. So, but even with this conclusion, we did set maximum levels for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and also including for food supplements, where we set levels which are as low as reasonably achievable. They are quite strict according to what we can see as from achievability point of view. And we got a court case against that, where the industry said, okay, but EFSA came to the conclusion that indeed the MOE is 10,000 or more, so it's of low concern, there is no need to regulate it. But of course, as a commission, we defended it that it is a prioritization tool. It is not saying that there is no risk. It can still be a risk. And indeed, it remains a genotoxic carcinogen. And there is no safe dose, so it allows us to still take measures. And finally, I must say the court has given the commission the right over all levels, at all levels. So indeed, it says that even in cases of MOEs lower than 10,000, we can still regulate. Oh, that's the one which is on the other one should have been deleted, yeah. So, and then finally acrylamide. So, where we see also there MOEs of 50, 283, 89 for a genotoxic carcinogen, so, which has been confirmed 2-3 years ago by EFSA, after indeed some doubts if it was a real genotoxic carcinogen, if there could not be a health-based guidance value be set. But there, of course, we see that indeed there are low MOEs. When we come to risk management measures, we have not set yet any maximum levels. We have followed a mitigation approach, where we say trying to as low as reasonable achievable. But indeed, we will never be able for acrylamide unless we prohibit the consumption of breakfast cereals, of coffee, of French fries, to get to an MOE of more than 10,000. So it would also be good if we would get a guidance to say, well, okay, when indeed is there a real risk, so to which level we should go for really saying, okay, towards also industry, now you have to take these measures because there's a real health. So also there, indeed, some extra guidance from risk assessment would be helpful. Of course, as I said, when we are regulating the contaminants, we are not only looking at the EFSA assessment, but we have also to have this feasibility and achievability by applying good practices. And that's also a challenge for the future, because we can see that aflatoxins is indeed, the prevalence is higher, the frequency of findings is higher. So we might get in a situation that the current levels are also, for instance, not achievable anymore for maize produced in the EU. What can we do? Can we increase the levels? Can we not? So we will have to, this is a big challenge because, and therefore, if we have a better assessment to which extent we could possibly do this increase without endangering public health, that would be certainly helpful in view of the future climate change. And then as regards also now the balance of risks of contaminants and the benefits of consumption of certain foods, also there in the health risk, health benefit assessment, a more exact assessment of what is the risk for the genotoxic compounds, to be then able to compare them, to quantitatively compare them with the benefits, that might also be helpful. So it brings me to the end of my talk. So indeed, and from this meeting, and it's an invitation to all of you, how can risk assessment for genotoxic carcinogens or for genotoxic compounds improve, evolve to provide more guidance for the risk manager? And I thank you for your attention.